A new Maritime Incident File has surfaced. If you appreciate these types of mermaid stories, take a short break to like and subscribe. Either way, enjoy.
The BODYCAM footage recovered from Petty Officer Marcus Webb shows something that the United States Coast Guard has never officially acknowledged. In the green-tinged darkness of the night vision setting, you can see the beam of his flashlight sweeping across the deck of a 28-foot center console, illuminating a tackle box still open, a half-eaten sandwich on the gunwale, and a ceramic mug of coffee that was still warm to the touch. You can hear Webb's breathing grow rapid as his light finds the water between the drifting vessels. A face stares up at him from just beneath the surface, pale as waterlogged flesh, with eyes like pools of black oil that reflected nothing. Then another face appears beside it. Then another. The footage captures 17 seconds of Webb's flashlight beam moving frantically across the water, counting the shapes that had gathered in the darkness between the boats, before the camera cuts to static and the recording ends. When the cutter reached Webb's last known position 40 minutes later, they found his patrol boat drifting empty, the engine still idling in neutral. His coffee was still warm. But to understand what Petty Officer Webb encountered that night, and what happened to the 14 fishermen who vanished from those waters, we need to go back to the morning of October 14th, 2007, when the Chesapeake Bay Annual Striper Classic began its 32nd year. The tournament had been a fixture of the Eastern Shore fishing community since 1975, drawing anglers from Virginia, Maryland, and as far north as New Jersey to compete for prize money that had grown to nearly $40,000 by 2007. That year, 31 boats registered for the night fishing division, a category that had been added in 1998 to take advantage of the striped bass feeding patterns that peaked in the hours between midnight and dawn. The waters off Tangier Sound had produced the winning catches for 3 consecutive years, and by sunset on the 14th, 23 vessels had anchored in a loose constellation across a 2-mile stretch of the Sound, their running lights creating a scattered galaxy on the black water. Among them was the Lucky Strike, a 32-foot Grady White captained by Raymond Delacroix, a retired postal worker from Salisbury who had fished these waters for 41 years. His crew that night included his son Martin, his nephew Thomas, and 2 longtime friends, Walter Briggs and Dennis Howell, both experienced watermen who knew the Chesapeake as intimately as the streets of their hometowns. None of them would survive the night. The Weather Service had forecast calm conditions, with winds from the southwest at 8 knots and seas of 1 to 2 feet. Visibility was excellent, with a waxing gibbous moon providing enough ambient light to see the silhouettes of other vessels across the tournament grounds. Barometric pressure was holding steady at 30.12 inches, and the water temperature had been measured at 64 degrees, ideal conditions for the autumn striper run that made this tournament famous among serious fishermen. It was, by every measure, a perfect night for fishing. But the old-timers at the Crisfield Marina had noticed something that the weather instruments couldn't measure. When Raymond Delacroix topped off his fuel tanks that afternoon, the dockmaster, a man named Earl Pruitt, who had worked that pier for 37 years, remarked that the gulls had been acting strange all week. They wouldn't fly out past the channel markers, he said, preferring to stay huddled on the docks and pilings as if afraid of what lay beyond the breakwater. And the crabs had stopped running in the shallows 3 days ago, retreating to deeper water as if something had spooked them from their usual hunting grounds. Earl said he'd never seen the crabs act like that in all his years on the water, not even before the worst storms. Delacroix had laughed it off, calling Earl a superstitious old fool, and his crew had joined in the ribbing as they cast off and headed for the fishing grounds. Earl Pruitt would later tell investigators that he watched the Lucky Strike's running lights until they disappeared beyond the point, and that he'd felt a cold certainty in his chest that he would never see Raymond Delacroix again. He could not have explained why, but he knew it as surely as he knew his own name. Raymond Delacroix would not live to see the sunrise. The tournament's radio channel, crackled with the usual chatter as the boats settled into their positions. Captains calling out greetings and friendly challenges, comparing water temperatures and bait conditions, bragging about their prospects for the night ahead. By 2130, the fleet had established a comfortable rhythm. Lines in the water, depth finders pinging, coolers stocked with provisions for the long night ahead. The Lucky Strike had anchored in 38 feet of water, roughly a mile and a quarter from the nearest vessel, a position Raymond had chosen based on a productive drift he remembered from the previous October. The anchor bit into the sandy bottom with a satisfying thunk that Raymond could feel through the deck, and he cut the engine, letting the silence of the open water settle over them like a blanket. Martin Delacroix, working the stern with his father, later remarked to Walter Briggs that the fish finder showed an unusual amount of activity deep below them. Contacts clustered at the bottom in formations he'd never seen before. Not schooling fish, he said, frowning at the screen with an expression that mixed confusion with the first stirrings of unease. Something else. The contacts weren't moving like fish move, darting and circling in the patterns that any experienced angler would recognize. They were holding position, almost motionless, as if waiting for something. The first sign that something was wrong came at approximately 2247. A boat called the Miss Molly, captained by a Virginia Beach electrician named Frank Womack, broke radio silence on Channel 68 to ask if anyone else was experiencing interference with their electronics. His depth finder had begun showing false readings, he reported, displaying contacts rising from 60 feet to 30 to 15 in a matter of seconds before the screen scrambled into static. The contacts were moving too fast, he said, faster than anything biological should be able to move through water. 3 other boats responded that they were experiencing similar issues. The compass aboard the Real Deal had begun spinning in slow circles, its needle refusing to settle on any heading, as if the magnetic poles had decided to dance around the boat in the darkness. The GPS unit on the Sea Spray had lost satellite lock entirely, displaying coordinates that placed the vessel somewhere in the middle of Delaware Bay, 40 miles from its actual position. The fish finder aboard the Chesapeake Queen was showing what appeared to be a solid wall of contacts rising from the depths, a reading that made no sense unless the entire water column beneath the boat had suddenly filled with life. These malfunctions were dismissed initially as atmospheric interference, perhaps related to solar activity or some quirk of the bay's magnetic properties that occasionally disrupted electronics. The experienced captains had seen equipment act strangely before, and they had learned not to trust their instruments over their own eyes and instincts. Howard Jessup, aboard the Bay Runner, joked over the radio that maybe the fish were finally getting smart enough to jam their signals. The laughter that followed was a little too loud, a little too forced, as if everyone on the channel was trying to convince themselves that there was nothing to worry about. But then Captain Womack reported something that changed the tone of the radio traffic entirely. His underwater lights, the high-intensity LEDs that many night fishermen used to attract bait fish, had illuminated something in the water column below his vessel. Shapes, he said, his voice strained with a disbelief that was rapidly curdling into something closer to fear. Moving shapes that were too large to be fish and too numerous to count. They were rising toward the surface, climbing through the water at a speed that defied everything he knew about marine life. What did he mean by shapes? Another captain asked, his voice steady, but carrying an undercurrent of concern that hadn't been there moments before. Womack's response was interrupted by a burst of static, and when his voice returned, he was speaking quickly, the words tumbling over each other in a way that suggested mounting panic. He said they had faces. He said they were looking at him through the glow of his underwater lights. He said their eyes were black, completely black, like holes in the water. He said they were smiling, but the smiles had too many teeth. Then the Miss Molly's radio went silent, and no one would hear from Frank Womack or his 2 crewmen ever again. The reaction among the fleet was mixed in those first minutes following Womack's final transmission. Some captains assumed it was a prank, the kind of tall tale that fishermen told to rattle the competition or simply to pass the time on a long night. Howard Jessup, aboard the Bay Runner, suggested over the radio that Womack had gotten into his cooler a little too enthusiastically and was seeing things in the chop. Others joined in the laughter, relieved to have an explanation that made sense in a world where things like faces in the water did not exist. But the laughter died quickly, replaced by the kind of silence that falls over a room when someone has told a joke that wasn't funny. Others weren't so certain. Calvin Rhodes, a charter captain with 23 years of experience on the Chesapeake, responded that he'd been watching his own fish finder during Womack's transmission, and that the contacts on his screen were unlike anything in his experience. They were rising, he confirmed, rising fast, and they were moving in formation, like a hunting pack coordinating its approach on prey. His voice carried the weight of a man who knew what he was seeing, but couldn't bring himself to believe it. But hunting packs belonged to wolves and lions, not to anything that swam in these waters. The Chesapeake held striped bass and blue crabs and the occasional shark that wandered in from the Atlantic, but nothing that hunted in coordinated groups, nothing that would stalk a fleet of boats in the darkness. Raymond Delacroix, monitoring the chatter from the wheelhouse of the Lucky Strike, made the decision that would seal his fate and the fate of his crew. Rather than pull anchor and return to port, he chose to motor toward the Miss Molly's last known position to render assistance. It was the choice that any experienced waterman would have made, the unwritten code of the sea demanding that vessels in distress receive aid from those nearby. He couldn't leave Frank Womack out there alone, not when something had clearly gone wrong, not when there might still be a chance to help. He could not have known that his act of courage was exactly what the creatures had been waiting for. What the darkness held beneath those waters was patient, and it was hungry, and it had learned across centuries of hunting to use the instincts of men against them. The Lucky Strike reached the coordinates where the Miss Molly should have been at approximately 2,312. Martin Delacroix, standing at the bow with a spotlight, was the first to see the vessel. The Miss Molly was drifting without power, her running lights extinguished, her deck illuminated only by the cold blue glow of the underwater lights that were still functioning beneath her hull. The light cast strange shadows on the water, making the surface look almost solid, like a floor that a man might walk across. The silence that surrounded the vessel was profound, broken only by the soft lap of water against fiberglass and the distant hum of the Lucky Strike's idling engine. Martin called out across the water, his voice carrying clearly in the still night air, but received no response. He called again, louder, using Frank Womack's name, using words of reassurance that echoed back from nowhere. The silence was worse than screaming would have been. Raymond brought the Lucky Strike alongside, close enough that Dennis Howell could reach across the gap with a boat hook and draw the vessels together. The hulls bumped gently, and the sound seemed impossibly loud in the quiet of the night. The deck of the Miss Molly was deserted. 3 fishing rods were still set in their holders, lines trailing into the water, bent under the weight of fish that no one remained to reel in. A portable radio sat on the gunwale, its power light glowing green, its speaker emitting only the soft hiss of static. A tackle box had been knocked over, its contents scattered across the deck, as if someone had stumbled through in a hurry or been dragged across the fiberglass. And there was blood. Not much, but enough to see clearly in the beam of Martin's spotlight. A smear of it on the transom, trailing over the side and disappearing into the dark water below, as if someone had been pulled over the edge and had tried desperately to hold on. Thomas Delacroix, the youngest of the crew at 26 years old, was the first to notice that the underwater lights were illuminating more than empty water. Shapes moved in the glow, circling the hull of the Miss Molly at a depth of perhaps 15 feet, their movements slow and deliberate like predators who knew their prey had nowhere to run. They were pale, he would later observe in a satellite phone call to his wife, a call that the Coast Guard would recover from cellular records during their investigation. Pale and wrong, he told her, his voice cracking with a fear that even hours of distance from the event could not diminish. Like people, but not people. Like women, he said, but twisted into something else, something that had never been meant to exist in any world that men were meant to understand. Their skin was the color of drowned flesh, gray-white, and somehow luminous in the darkness. Their faces had too many teeth. That satellite phone call, placed at 2319, would be the last communication from anyone aboard the Lucky Strike. What happened in the minutes that followed can only be reconstructed from physical evidence recovered in the subsequent investigation, and from the single piece of video footage that survived the night. A GoPro camera mounted to the hardtop of a vessel called the Chesapeake Queen captured events from a distance of approximately 800 yards. The footage is grainy, and the zoom is inadequate, but certain details are unmistakable. At 2324, the lights of the Lucky Strike, which had been visible alongside the drifting Miss Molly, began to move erratically, suggesting the vessel was either under power or being pushed by forces beneath the waterline. At 2325, what appears to be a struggle is visible on the deck of the Lucky Strike, silhouettes moving frantically, arms raised against something that cannot be seen clearly at that distance. At 2326, the silhouette of a figure is visible falling or being pulled over the side of the Lucky Strike. At 2327, a second figure follows, this one appearing to be dragged across the deck before disappearing over the gunwale. At 2328, a third figure, larger than the others, possibly Raymond Delacroix himself, is seen stumbling toward the wheelhouse before something rises from the water and pulls him back. At 2329, the Lucky Strike's running lights went dark. The GoPro footage continues for another 43 minutes, during which the camera captured the lights of 6 additional vessels going dark in sequence, like candles being snuffed out one by one across the tournament grounds. The screams were too distant to be recorded clearly, but the audio analysis conducted by investigators detected human voices raised in what could only be terror, carried across the water in the stillness of the night. By 0015 on October 15th, the radio channel that had been alive with chatter 3 hours earlier had fallen completely silent. Not a single vessel was transmitting. The creatures had moved through the fleet with terrible efficiency, taking vessel after vessel in the darkness, leaving behind only drifting hulls and the debris of interrupted lives. The pattern, when later reconstructed by investigators who obtained the GoPro footage through unofficial channels, showed a coordinated assault. The creatures had not attacked randomly. They had established a perimeter around the densest concentration of boats, cutting off escape routes to the north and south, then worked inward, taking the outermost vessels first before moving to those anchored closer to the center. It was a hunting strategy, refined over generations, or perhaps over millennia. The intelligence behind it was undeniable. These were not mindless predators acting on instinct. They had watched the fleet gather, counted the boats, noted the positions of each vessel. They had waited until the darkness was complete and the fishermen were settled into the rhythms of the long night. And then they had struck with a precision that spoke of planning, of communication, of a social structure complex enough to coordinate dozens of hunters across 2 miles of open water. The boats that were anchored at the edges of the fleet, beyond the perimeter, were left untouched. Their crews would return to port at dawn, confused by the radio silence, but unaware that anything terrible had happened until they reached the docks and saw the Coast Guard vessels streaming toward the tournament grounds. Those who had anchored within the perimeter had no such fortune. The creatures gave no quarter and left no survivors among the boats they targeted. The Coast Guard station Crisfield received its first emergency call at 0023 when a fisherman aboard the Sea Mist, anchored at the far northern edge of the tournament grounds, reported that he could no longer see or reach any of the other boats on radar or radio. He described a feeling of profound wrongness, a sense that something catastrophic had occurred in the darkness to the south, and he requested immediate assistance. His voice, preserved in the Coast Guard's radio logs, carries a tremor that suggests he knew more than he was willing to say, as if he had seen something in the darkness that he could not bring himself to describe. His Mayday was the last transmission received from the tournament fleet that night. The Sea Mist was found drifting empty at 0847 the following morning. Her anchor still set, her crew of 3 vanished without explanation. Whatever had happened to the boats to the south had eventually reached the northern edge of the fleet, claiming those who had thought themselves safe. Petty Officer Marcus Webb was part of the initial response team dispatched from Station Crisfield at 0031. His patrol boat, a 25-foot response craft, was the first official vessel to enter the tournament grounds, and his BODYCAM footage provides the most detailed record of what the response teams encountered. The water was flat calm. Webb noted in his official report, like black glass reflecting nothing. No wind, no chop, no movement except the slow drift of the abandoned vessels. The moon had set an hour before, and the darkness was nearly absolute, broken only by the running lights of boats that no longer had anyone aboard to turn them off. The first vessel he approached was the Real Deal, a 24-foot well craft that had been anchored roughly half a mile from the Miss Molly's last known position. The boat was drifting in slow circles, her engine still running in neutral, her deck lights still burning. 2 rods were bent in their holders, suggesting fish had taken the bait and were still hooked, pulling against lines that no one remained to tend. Webb secured his patrol boat alongside and boarded the Real Deal with his sidearm drawn. The BODYCAM footage shows him moving through the vessel methodically, checking the small cabin, the head, the storage compartments. He found coffee cups still half full, a portable heater still running in the cabin, personal effects scattered as if the crew had left in extreme haste or had been taken by surprise. There was no sign of struggle, no blood, no indication of violence. The crew had simply vanished, leaving behind everything except their bodies. What the BODYCAM captured next has been the subject of intense debate among the small community of researchers who have obtained copies of the footage through unofficial channels. As Webb returned to the stern of the Real Deal, his flashlight beams swept across the water between the drifting vessel and his patrol boat. For approximately 3 seconds, the footage shows a shape beneath the surface. It was humanoid in outline, pale enough to be visible against the dark water, with what appears to be a long, powerful tail where legs should have been. The head was tilted upward toward the light, and 2 dark voids marked where eyes should have been, black and depthless as the water itself. Webb's breathing on the audio track becomes rapid and shallow, and the camera jerks away as he steps backward involuntarily. When he redirects the flashlight to the same spot, the shape is gone. His voice, barely above a whisper, can be heard saying a single word, Jesus. For the next hour, Webb documented a scene of inexplicable devastation, moving from vessel to vessel in the darkness, each boat telling the same impossible story. 11 vessels were located within the tournament grounds, all of them drifting, all of them abandoned, all of them showing signs of crews who had left in the middle of routine activities. Coffee cups half full, sandwiches half eaten, radios still on, tuned to channels that no one was transmitting on. The Lucky Strike was found at 0112, still secured to the Miss Molly, where Raymond Delacroix had brought her alongside. Both vessels were empty. The blood on the Miss Molly's transom had been joined by additional stains on both boats, but the quantities were small, inconsistent with the kind of violence that would be required to overcome 5 men on the Lucky Strike and 3 on the Miss Molly. It was as if the crews had been lifted away, plucked from the decks without the struggle that desperate men should have mounted. Webb photographed everything, his BODYCAM recording each detail, each abandoned piece of equipment, each half-finished meal that testified to the sudden and total nature of whatever had happened. At 0147, while photographing the interior of a vessel called the Bay Thunder, Webb's radio crackled with a transmission from the cutter that had been dispatched to assist in the search. The cutter, USCGC Hammerhead, reported that their sonar was showing multiple large contacts moving beneath the surface, contacts that did not match any known marine species in their database. The contacts appeared to be circling the tournament grounds at a depth of approximately 40 feet, moving in coordinated patterns that suggested intelligence rather than instinct. The sonar operator described them as holding formation like a military unit, each contact maintaining precise distance from the others as they patrolled the perimeter of the area. There were at least 30 of them, possibly more. Webb was ordered to return to his patrol boat and proceed to a rendezvous point 1 mile to the east. The BODYCAM footage shows him moving quickly across the Bay Thunder's deck, his flashlight beam dancing ahead of him, his free hand resting on the grip of his sidearm. He reached the gunwale and prepared to step across to his patrol boat. That's when the scratching began. It came from the hull beneath him, a sound like fingernails dragging across fiberglass, slow and deliberate. Not the random scraping of debris or the bump of curious fish, but something intentional, something that knew he was there. Webb froze, the BODYCAM capturing his suddenly still posture, the beam of his flashlight pointing at his own feet. The scratching moved along the length of the hull, from bow to stern, then stopped. Silence followed, profound and absolute, the kind of silence that seems to swallow sound rather than merely lacking it. Then the scratching resumed, this time on the opposite side of the vessel. They were testing him, probing his position, calculating his vulnerabilities. Webb made a decision that may have saved his life, at least temporarily. Rather than wait for whatever was circling the hull to make its move, he vaulted across the gap to his patrol boat, landing hard on the deck and scrambling toward the helm. The BODYCAM footage shows him starting the engine and pushing the throttle forward, the patrol boat surging away from the Bay Thunder at full speed. As he fled, his spotlight swept across the water astern. The footage captured them clearly for the first time. They had surfaced in his wake, rising from the black water like corpses from a mass grave. Pale faces turned toward the departing boat, black eyes tracking his retreat, needle teeth visible in mouths that seemed to stretch too wide for human anatomy. The way they moved through the water was wrong, propelling themselves with undulating motions of their powerful tails, while their upper bodies remained eerily still, as if the two halves of their anatomy belonged to different creatures entirely. Their upper bodies were recognizably humanoid, but wrong in ways that the human eye registered as deeply disturbing. The skin was the color of drowned flesh, gray-white, and somehow luminous in the darkness, as if lit from within by some cold and terrible light. Where a human woman's chest would be covered by clothing, these creatures displayed torsos wrapped in organic scales, gray and glistening. It formed a natural covering like a grotesque corset of living tissue. Their hair hung in wet tangles, dark as seaweed and clinging to their shoulders and faces. Their arms ended in hands that were almost human, but elongated and tipped with claws that gleamed in the spotlight's beam. Webbed fingers spread as they reached toward the retreating boat, grasping at the water as if trying to pull themselves through it faster. Below the waterline, powerful tails churned the surface, silver gray and muscular, ending in ragged fins that split the water with terrible efficiency. Webb counted 17 of them before his patrol boat carried him beyond the range of his spotlight. 17 pale faces watching him flee, 17 mouths full of needle teeth, 17 sets of black and lidless eyes. But more were surfacing behind them, shapes breaching the water in growing numbers, called to the surface by some signal he could not hear, or perhaps simply drawn by the sound of his engine. The footage ends shortly after, as Webb secured his camera and focused on reaching the rendezvous coordinates. But the recording would later reveal something he didn't notice in the moment of his escape. One of the creatures had been closer than the others, surfacing perhaps 15 feet from his stern. When the image is enhanced and analyzed frame by frame, her mouth appears to be moving. The audio analysis suggests she was making sounds, vocalizations that fell below the threshold of Webb's conscious perception, but that, registered on the sensitive microphone of his BODYCAM. The sound, when isolated and amplified, bears a disturbing resemblance to human speech, though the words, if words they were, remain unidentifiable. She may have been calling to him. She may have been calling others. The rendezvous with UCGC Hammerhead never occurred. Webb's patrol boat was found at 0234, drifting empty approximately 3/4 of a mile from the coordinates he had been given. The engine was still running, idling in neutral. His coffee cup, which he had filled from a thermos before boarding the first vessel, was found on the helm console. It was still warm. His sidearm was found on the deck, unfired. His BODYCAM had been knocked from its mounting, lying face down on the deck with its battery exhausted from continuous recording. There was no sign of struggle, no blood, no indication of what had happened to him. He had simply vanished, like all the others. The Coast Guard's search and rescue operation continued through the following day and into the night of October 15th. Additional vessels were dispatched from stations along the Virginia and Maryland coasts, and a helicopter conducted aerial sweeps of the tournament grounds and surrounding waters. Divers were deployed at first light, tasked with searching the bottom for any sign of the missing fishermen or their remains. What they found was not what anyone had expected. The seafloor in the area of the tournament grounds, which should have been relatively flat and composed of sand and mud, was scarred by deep furrows that ran in parallel lines toward the deeper water of the bay's main channel. The furrows were approximately 3 feet wide and of varying lengths, some extending for dozens of yards before disappearing into the murk. The dive team leader, a chief petty officer with 15 years of experience, described them in his report as looking like something large had been dragged across the bottom. Many somethings. The pattern was consistent with bodies being pulled toward deeper water by creatures moving along the seafloor. No human remains were recovered. The divers also reported that the water in the deepest sections of the channel was significantly colder than it should have been for the season, as if currents from some even deeper place were welling up from below. One diver, speaking off the record to a researcher years later, admitted that he had seen something in the murk of the channel, a pale shape watching him from the edge of visibility. He had ascended immediately and refused to dive again for the remainder of the operation. By sunset on October 15th, the Coast Guard had accounted for all 31 vessels that had registered for the night fishing tournament. 23 had been found abandoned in the tournament grounds. 4 had returned to port before midnight, their crews reporting nothing unusual. 4 others had anchored outside the main fleet and had departed at first light without incident, their captains unaware that anything had happened until they reached shore. The 14 men who had vanished, Raymond and Martin Delacroix, Thomas Delacroix, Walter Briggs, Dennis Howell, Frank Womack, and his 2 crewmen, the 3 men aboard the Sea Mist, and 3 others from vessels scattered across the tournament grounds, were never found. Neither was Petty Officer Marcus Webb. The official investigation, conducted jointly by the Coast Guard and the Maryland Department of Natural Resources, concluded 6 weeks later with a finding that attributed the disappearances to a sudden, severe weather event that had caused multiple vessels to capsize, throwing their crews into the water where they had succumbed to hypothermia before rescue could arrive. The report was 47 pages long and contained detailed meteorological analysis, oceanographic data, and testimony from the surviving captains who had returned safely to port. It did not mention Petty Officer Webb's BODYCAM footage. It did not mention the GoPro recording from the Chesapeake Queen. It did not mention the furrows on the seafloor or the sonar contacts that the Hammerhead had reported. It did not mention the creatures. This conclusion was reached despite the fact that not a single vessel had capsized, despite the fact that the weather on the night in question had been calm and clear, despite the fact that no bodies had been recovered, an outcome statistically improbable if the victims had simply drowned in shallow water. And despite the existence of Petty Officer Webb's BODYCAM footage, which was classified as equipment malfunction and sealed in the evidence files at Coast Guard headquarters in Washington, The families of the missing men were told that their loved ones had been lost to the sea, victims of an act of nature that could not have been predicted or prevented. They were offered condolences and compensation, and they were discouraged from asking questions that the authorities could not answer. Some accepted this. Others did not. The wife of Thomas Delacroix, who had received his final satellite phone call, spent 3 years trying to obtain the official records of the investigation. Her FOIA requests were denied on grounds of national security. Her congressman, when approached for help, told her privately that there were some matters that were beyond his ability to address, and that she would be wise to accept the official explanation and move on with her life. She did not move on. She could not when she had heard the terror in her husband's voice in that final phone call, not when she knew that the official explanation was a lie designed to protect the tourism industry and the fishing economy of the Eastern Shore. She hired a private investigator who eventually obtained a copy of Webb's BODYCAM footage from a source within the Coast Guard who refused to be identified. The source had served on the Hammerhead that night, had seen the sonar contacts circling beneath the tournament grounds, had heard the screams on the radio before the channels went silent. He had carried the weight of what he knew for 3 years before he decided that the families deserved the truth more than the Coast Guard deserved his silence. What she saw on that recording destroyed any hope she had of closure, but it gave her something that the official explanation never could. It gave her the truth. The Chesapeake Bay Annual Striper Classic was permanently canceled following the 2007 tournament. The official reason given was declining participation and lack of sponsorship funding. Earl Pruitt, the dockmaster at Crisfield, who had warned Raymond Delacroix about the strange behavior of the gulls and crabs, closed his marina the following spring. When asked by a local reporter why he was retiring after nearly 4 decades, he said simply that the bay had changed and that he no longer felt welcome on its waters. He died in 2019, and according to his family, he never went near the water again after that October night. He had known somehow what waited in those waters. And once you know, you cannot unknow. The BODYCAM footage has never been officially released, but copies have circulated among researchers and investigators who specialize in unexplained maritime incidents. Frame-by-frame analysis has confirmed the presence of the creatures in multiple segments of the recording. Their anatomy, while partially obscured by darkness and water distortion, is consistent across all sightings. Humanoid upper bodies with pale, seemingly luminescent skin. Black eyes that appear to absorb rather than reflect light. Mouths containing multiple rows of needle-like teeth. Torsos covered in organic scaling that suggests an evolutionary adaptation somewhere between fish and mammal. Powerful tails that replace human lower limbs. Webbed hands with elongated, clawed fingers capable of grasping and holding. They are not mermaids, not in the sense that mythology has presented that concept. They are not the beautiful sirens of sailors' tales, singing songs of enchantment to lure men to gentle deaths. They are something else entirely, something older and more terrible than the singing sirens of ancient legend. They are predators, evolved over eons, to hunt in the darkness where light does not reach. What emerged from the depths of Chesapeake Bay on the night of October 14, 2007, was a hunting pack, coordinated and efficient, drawn to the surface by the lights and sounds of the tournament fleet. They had learned somehow that human vessels meant prey, and they had developed tactics to exploit human compassion, using distressed boats as bait to draw others close. The Miss Molly's crew had been the first taken, but their vessel became a trap that ensnared the Lucky Strike. And the Lucky Strike's distress drew others still, each vessel that approached becoming another opportunity for the creatures to feed. By the time the remaining boats realized what was happening, it was far too late. The creatures had surrounded the fleet, cutting off escape routes, picking off vessels one by one in the darkness. The few boats that escaped did so only because they had anchored at the edges of the tournament grounds, beyond the perimeter that the creatures had established. In the years since the incident, there have been other disappearances in the Chesapeake Bay region. A solo kayaker who vanished from the York River in 2011. A couple on a small sailboat who failed to return from a sunset cruise in 2014. A charter boat that went missing with 4 passengers aboard in 2018. Found drifting 3 days later with no one aboard and coffee still warm in the galley. The Coast Guard attributes these incidents to accidents, to weather, to the inherent dangers of maritime recreation. But watermen who have worked the Chesapeake for generations tell different stories when the tourists aren't listening. They speak of lights beneath the surface that move against the current, phosphorescent glows that pulse and fade like signals being passed between creatures lurking in the depths. Of sonar contacts that rise from the depths and then vanish. Of nets that come up torn by something stronger than any fish, the mesh shredded by claws that left marks no crab or shark could make. Of nights when the water goes unnaturally still, and the crabs retreat to the shallows, and the gulls refuse to fly, as if every creature in the bay knows something that humans have forgotten how to hear. Of engines that die for no reason in certain stretches of the channel, leaving boats drifting helplessly while something circles beneath the hull. Of sounds in the fog that might be seals, but somehow never are. They know what lives in the deep channels of the bay, in the underwater canyons that reach down to depths that sunlight never touches, where the water is cold and black and ancient things have waited since before humanity learned to build boats. They have known for a long time. They just don't talk about it, because talking about it doesn't change anything and only makes people think you've lost your mind. The creatures were here before the first English settlers arrived on these shores. The Powhatan people had names for them, names that the colonists never recorded because they dismissed such talk as primitive superstition. There are fragments in the colonial records, accounts of fishing boats that vanished without explanation, of bodies found on beaches with injuries that no shark or shipwreck could explain, of watermen who returned from night voyages changed somehow, refusing ever to speak of what they had seen. Captain John Smith himself noted in his journals that the natives warned him against venturing into certain waters after dark, though he attributed their caution to simple fear of the unfamiliar. The watermen of the 18th and 19th centuries encountered them occasionally, always at night, always in circumstances that could be explained away by those who hadn't witnessed it themselves. Oystermen who worked the bay in the decades before the Civil War spoke of pale shapes following their boats on moonless nights, of nets that were cut by something sharper than any fish possessed, of crew members who fell overboard and were never seen again. They learned the patterns, the seasons, the places where the creatures congregated. They learned when to fish and when to stay on shore. And they learned never to speak of it to outsiders, because outsiders never believed and often brought trouble. And now, in the 21st century, they remain, waiting in the darkness, hunting when the opportunity presents itself, patient in ways that cold-blooded things have always been patient. If you fish the Chesapeake at night, as thousands still do despite the risks that most refuse to acknowledge, you may see them someday. A pale face in your wake, a shape beneath your running lights, eyes that watch from just below the surface. If you're fortunate, you'll convince yourself it was a seal, a trick of the light, a reflection of the moon on disturbed water. You'll go home and tell no one, and you'll avoid that stretch of water forever after. If you're less fortunate, you'll become another statistic, another unexplained disappearance, another name on a list that the Coast Guard maintains but never releases to the public. Your boat will be found drifting, your coffee still warm, your last moments known only to the things that took you. The 14 men who vanished that October night, along with Petty Officer Marcus Webb, who tried to save them, deserve to have their story told. Not the official story, with its impossible weather events and its convenient explanations. The true story, as documented by Webb's BODYCAM, as witnessed by the survivors who made it back to port, as whispered by the watermen who know better than to fish those grounds after dark. Something ancient and terrible lives in the waters of Chesapeake Bay, It hunts with intelligence and patience. It has claimed lives for centuries, and it will claim more. The water remembers, even when men forget. If you have had an experience on these waters, or on any waters, that you cannot explain, I would ask you to share it in the comments below. Others have seen what you have seen. Others have survived what you have survived. And by sharing our accounts, we create a record that cannot be classified or explained away or buried in the evidence files of official investigations. The truth lives in the testimony of witnesses, and the truth, however terrible, deserves to be told. Subscribe to Maritime Incident Files for more accounts from the deep.